Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my first wrap-up video of 2024, but also my final one talking about the books that I read in 2023. I read 8 books in total in December, which is quite a lot for me. I don't usually read that many. I think it's just because of that downtime between Christmas and New Year. I normally have that time completely off work and it's a really nice period where you can just relax, do a bit of reading, take it quite easy. And so I just got through quite a few books. I don't want this video to become really long though, so I'm going to jump straight in to the first book I read, which was Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. I don't have a copy of this one because I borrowed it from the library, but I absolutely loved this. And I loved it so much, in fact, that I made a full video about it because it was the first book I read in the month. I didn't want to wait so long and I wanted to tell you about it while it was still fresh in my mind. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that here, but I will link to the video in the description. It's just a really smart, interesting story that takes place over the course of about 1,000 years. And it's a love letter to Durham and the cathedral at its heart and the people that live there. I really thought it was fantastic. It was one of my favourite books of the year. It is a little bit of an intimidating one, especially the first part of it, which is written in this prose poetry style. But I would encourage you not to sleep on this because it's an absolute corker. I think it comes out in paperback in the UK in about a month's time. So if you haven't read it yet, that would be a really good opportunity. I expect to see it in like the Waterstones buy one get one half price deal. Really brilliant. The next book that I read was Loot by Tania James. Now, this has been on my radar since it was longlisted for the National Book Awards in the US last year, but it's only just coming out in the UK this month, I think on the 25th of January, and I was very grateful to receive an advance copy from Harville Secker to review. This is a historical fiction novel that starts out in the late 1700s in India, at a time when colonial forces are grappling for power both between themselves and with local leaders like Mysore's Tipu Sultan. The story follows a young man named Abbas. He's a talented woodcarver summoned before the Sultan, and he's tasked with building an automaton, which is like a kind of mechanical moving statue. And the Sultan wants this to be of a tiger biting the neck of an Englishman. Abbas is teamed up with this older Frenchman named Lucien Dulise, who seems to have been exchanged with France for something, and together they need to complete the job in time for an upcoming festival. This could, in some books, have been the entire premise for the novel, and at first I thought it was going that way, but then they kind of completed the job really early on. Instead, the book then zips through the decades and the automaton becomes more of a symbol for other things. For Abbas, it's his wasted potential, the things he didn't learn from Dulise but he wanted to. And for Dulise's adoptive daughter Joanne, it's a connection to his memory because she looks back really fondly on him working on it in the workshop. And also because at this time she met Abbas, who she found this really curious and interesting boy. At first, I thought this book was quite similar to The Architect's Apprentice by Elif Shafak. And that could be a pretty shallow comparison that like orientalizes the two books because they're from quite different cultures. The Architect's Apprentice is set in the Ottoman Empire, whereas this is set in India. But I do think they have a lot in common. Both have young, ambitious boys from humble means that are thrust into these strange royal environments. They are both about passing craft down from one generation to the other, and they both have preoccupations with animals, with adventure and subterfuge and escape. And while that comparison holds up for much of the start of the book, it does kind of peel off and become something quite different. There's a bit that I really enjoyed where we see Abbas from the perspective of a white crewman aboard a ship. And not only does this give us like this new view of our main character, but it also brings to life the realities of these long, harsh voyages and the sickness that can often come with it. The second half of the book then is set in this big stately home in the UK when Abbas is older, and it introduces some additional characters that I thought were really well fleshed out. It doesn't romanticize the characters, they are all flawed in their own different ways, but it does empathize with them. I won't spoil what happened, but after I finished the book I had a look at some reviews, and one reviewer described it as a heist novel, and that's actually quite a fun and apt way to describe it. Overall, a really enjoyable historical story about what people will do to honour and protect the people that they love. Definitely one to look out for historical fiction fans. And I kind of stuck with the historical fiction vibe because next I read Rizzio by Denise Mina. This was a book that was not on my radar until Louise Savage mentioned it on her channel, but she really sold it to me and so I picked up a copy. This is from a series that reimagines some Scottish tales, which also includes a book that you might have heard of called Hex by Jenny Fagan. This is a book about an attempt to complete an assassination and a coup to take control of the Scottish crown. Mary, Queen of Scots, is in charge and she's heavily pregnant at the time of the novel, and a man called David Rizzio is her closest ally and advisor. Mary's husband, however, however, does not like this, and he doesn't like the closeness that Mary has with Rizzio. He doesn't like her power. He doesn't like the fact that the child that he and Mary are expecting will have a stronger claim to the throne than he will. And so he is involved in a plot to deal with all of these things at once. And the story takes place over the course of about a day when shit is about to go down. And my God, this is so good. This is pitch perfect historical writing for me. It doesn't try to be like a contemporary to the time narrator. It's absolutely looking back at it through modern eyes, which I am fine with. And there are also so many surprising twists and turns that kept my jaw on the floor at multiple times throughout this very short novel. I really liked the writing, and it felt in some ways like a very good, gripping narrative non-fiction book. Just the way the story is told brought to mind the way Patrick Radden Keefe tells his stories, working from what's known but then filling in the gaps with what was thought and said by the characters. It was so incredibly tense, jumping around between the different characters on different sides, all jostling for power, all of whom have different amounts of knowledge about what's going on, and often thinking they have more control than they do over the situation. It felt like watching like a really gripping chess game, which I haven't actually done before, but if it feels like this, maybe I'll get into watching chess. And actually, interestingly, it does start off with a game. The orchestrator of the murder and its intended victim are both playing a tennis match. It's such a good euphemism for the wedge between the characters, like their different feelings towards each other, and it's quite a fun way for the introduction of these characters to reverse the power dynamic between them, because on the tennis court, Rizzio has the athletic advantage, but he does not have the political advantage in the actual royal court. The tension is ramped high right from this moment, and it does not let up at all. It is brutal and it is heartbreaking. I was totally hooked throughout. It's a very short read that I'd recommend starting in the morning, because if you do not, you will get drawn in and you'll end up staying up all night because you will not want to put it down. I actually loved it so much that as soon as I finished it, I went ahead and picked up Denise Mina's latest book, which is another historical fiction novel called Three Fires. Super, super, super. The next book I read might have a title that suggests it's still historical fiction, but it's not. That is Delphi by Clare Pollard. This is a book that I've been interested in for a while because there's been a lot of fiction that retells Greek myths, and I think this is something that takes the same sort of inspiration and the same material, but does something a little bit different with it. This is actually a contemporary story that charts the experience of a woman going through the COVID lockdowns with her husband and her 10-year-old son. She is an academic and she has an interest in prophecy in the ancient world, and that's kind of reflected in the book by the fact that it's broken down into lots of short vignette-y chapters, each named after a type of prophecy. Some of these are ones that you would recognize, like astrology or tarot. Some of them are ones that sound pretty legit, like nephomancy, which is prophecy based on clouds. And there are some which I thought were completely made up, like Googlemancy, which is prophecy by Google's search autocomplete, or Shufflemancy, which is prophecy by music playlists. But I googled them and apparently they're actually a thing, which kind of blew my mind. This is a book that's kind of in the same ballpark as Nobody Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, in that it's about a very particular time and subcultural experience, that of like a middle-class family going through COVID and its lockdowns in the UK. And it similarly has a bit of a family emergency towards the end that puts some things into perspective. I am a bit torn on this one. I definitely liked it more than the Lockwood book, partly because the experience was a bit more accessible to me, but also because it didn't feel quite so self-satisfied and smug. And I did think it was full of funny observations about the contradictions and follies of people as we went through all of that. I'm not really someone who annotates or takes notes while I read, but there were lots of funny, often depressing turns of phrase that I took photos of and kept on my phone. Commentary on how we've made this like Faustian pact with tech companies, how capitalism has made us all desperate to make our lives into stories where we're the protagonists, or how in a busy marriage where you've got kids and there might be an unequal distribution of like home labour, an affair could be forgiven for the sex but not the time, because who has the time? There were also reflections and theories that I found really interesting or compelling. There was one where Clare Pollard talks about how we as a species have become preoccupied with the future in a way that humans hundreds or thousands of years ago just didn't have to care, or how the internet has kind of filled the void left by religion, because rather than God being this omniscient force that remembers and keeps a tally of everything we do, that's all recorded on the internet instead, just waiting for someone to pass judgment. This was all super interesting and thought-provoking, but as much as I loved the writing and the ideas, a trap that I think the book falls into a little bit is that it's almost just recounting events. It was very much this real thing happened and then this real thing happened, and do you remember when this other real thing happened? It was an interesting trip down memory lane for me, but it was almost a blow by blow of the COVID years and the absurdity of the Trump obsessed news cycle and of the many unknowns we were scrambling to understand and take control of at that time. It might be a little bit too soon for some people to go through the COVID experience again. I didn't mind that personally, but I do wish it had done a little bit more with the premise. A very well written book that I don't think necessarily capitalised on its promise. Next up, I read Wild Houses, which is the debut novel from the Irish author Colin Barrett, which also comes out later this month. In fact, I think it comes out on the 25th of January as well. But I'm very grateful to the folks over at Jonathan Cape who were kind enough to send over an advance copy. To be honest, I didn't really know what to expect from this, but it is an absolute treat and another win for Irish fiction. This is a book set in County Mayo, in and kind of just outside a town called Ballina, and it's set largely in a number of houses where wild things, drug-related things, happen. Right at the start of the book, we are dropped straight into the action. The house of one of the main characters, called Dev, is being used as a bit of a safe house for this drug-dealing enterprise, and two of the people working for that enterprise turn up with someone in tow they've just kidnapped, this teenage boy who they're hoping to use as a bargaining chip to get some money that they're owed. We then jump back in time only by a couple of days to see the circumstances around the kidnap and the build up to it, and we get a glimpse of the relationships of this teenager with his family and with his girlfriend Nikki, and she kind of becomes our second main character. I thought the character work here was just fantastic. They were all very well observed, and they all felt like they lived complex interior lives, and they felt very real. They had interesting and believable motivations, and in particular the dialogue just sparkles. It felt hugely real. It felt like listening in on actual conversations. I felt like I knew who these people were, and it was a huge contributing factor to why the characters themselves felt so fleshed out. There isn't like a real huge plot, but there is a lot of tension, and what's going on between these characters feels important and life impacting to them. Like, it's not world shattering. This isn't an international drug dealing enterprise that's about to get busted. It's about a bunch of low ranking footmen in a drugs gang in a small Irish town. But at the same time, because of how well it was done, the stakes felt really high. The one thing I don't love about this book, to be totally honest, is the cover. There is another cover that I think is a bit more aesthetically pleasing, and I don't know if that was like an earlier version or it's the US edition or something, but whatever it is, it looks nicer. At the same time though, I can kind of see why they haven't ended up using it in the UK. The other cover is pretty dark and brooding in a way that the book just isn't. There is plenty of violence and misery here, but it's done with a lightness of touch and a humour that tonally just doesn't quite match that cover. This one's a bit of a better match, even if it is ugly, but I'm sure they could have done better, and I'm a little bit worried that this cover might put people off from picking this one up. I think if you liked the beasting, you are almost certainly going to enjoy this. It is really great, and I highly recommend it. My final 5-star review of the year, this one. Next, something completely different, and this is a little non-fiction book called Twas, the Nightshift Before Christmas. This is like a small little Christmas addendum, and I guess probably a cash-in to Adam Kay's This Is Going to Hurt, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a series of diary entries from his time as a junior doctor on a maternity ward, and he catalogues his experiences up to and including a traumatic experience that led him to leave the medical profession. These are additional entries to his diary that didn't make it into the original book. It covers, I think, 6 Christmas periods, including Christmas Day on each occasion, that Adam Kay worked over a period of 7 years, kind of just what happened on the wards and how it affected his personal life. Although there are serious issues addressed here, the mode is primarily comedy, and I think Adam Kay is now like a stand-up and he does like comedy writing, and it recounts funny interactions with patients, people getting stuff stuck in various orifices, hapless colleagues, all that jazz. I have read This Is Going to Hurt, and I remember enjoying the original book, and I wouldn't say I disliked this, but I did enjoy it less. I don't know if there's something different about this one, or I've just moved on a bit as a reader, but I breezed through it without really engaging with it all that much. There were a couple of entries also where I just felt like a little bit uncomfortable, because I thought if I was the patient being talked about, even if you changed my name and changed the date a little bit, I would definitely know it was me. Like, the details of what was going on were so specific, and it made me feel a little bit icky. It wasn't that the whole way through, it was just on a couple of occasions. But yeah, overall this was fine. It was fun to read something kind of in keeping with the season. I don't know if I'd recommend rushing out and buying it. Right, 2 more to go, and my penultimate read of the year was The Mouse and His Child by Russell Hoban. This is a children's book first published in the 1960s, and it's about a wind-up toy of a father and a son mouse duo whose hands are like clasped, and when they are wound up, they dance in a circle. They start out in a toy shop and they kind of live in this magnificent dollhouse, but they are bought as Christmas gifts before being broken and they end up in a dump. They then go on a little bit of an odyssey to find and return to the dollhouse, and they meet this wide cast of characters along the way. There's a soothsaying frog, there is a homeless man described in terms that we probably would not use today, and to be honest, I've kind of failed to see the purpose of this character in the story, and there's this main antagonist called Manny Rat. To be honest, I cannot decide if I enjoyed this one or not. I was definitely pulled in by it. It moves along at a pretty blistering pace with lots of highs and lows, plans that go well, and then deep pits of despair where they don't know how they're going to fix things or get to the next step in their journey. And the mice really do get around, considering they literally have to be wound up in order to travel anywhere. They cannot move unless the key on their back is turned. And I quite enjoyed the breadth of interactions and the steps on their journey. They did quite a lot. I found it quite funny that they were on this quest for self-winding. They basically wanted to be able to wind themselves up without relying on other characters. It was all quite fun. It was written with an underlying humour that made me think a little bit of Terry Pratchett's Bromeliad, which I really loved. That said though, I did start out a little bit uneasy with it. Some of the descriptions, especially about the homeless man that I've already mentioned, and this like money grabbing rat, it was giving me a little bit of anxiety about what that symbolism was there to do. And while I don't think it was particularly problematic in the end, I'm still a little bit unsure about it. And I've got to say, this was amazingly and frequently bleak. There is a shocking amount of death, destruction, murder, betrayal, and just pure punishment of the characters going on. Maybe kids were tougher back then, I don't know, but it felt like a pretty dark version of Toy Story. So yeah, I'm on the fence a little bit with it. I imagine if you have kids that are up to a bit of constant mortal danger, then it could be a lot of fun read aloud, but I would give it a flip through first. My final book of 2023, which I actually started before any of the other ones that I've talked about today, but I just happened to finish it last, was God's Children Are Broken Little Things by Arinze Ifeakandu. This is a short story collection that this year won the Dylan Thomas Prize, and these are all stories set in Nigeria, which I didn't realise at the time, but are all about the lives of gay men. When I found that out, I guess I was a little bit worried that the stories might be kind of one note and risk them covering the same ground over and over, but my worries were not well founded at all, because this is a really good variety of different stories and they're told in different styles. There are stories written in each of the first, second and third person perspectives. I won't go into the details of all the stories here, but something that was really refreshing to me was that this was not a book about gay men and HIV or gay men suffering violence and death, which I think could have been an easier play, but for me, much less interesting. Instead, most of these are stories about how gay men experience things in life that a lot of other people do, about infidelity and the breakdown of a marriage, about the loss of a loved one, or difficult relationships with parents. I really appreciated it for that. Like, I don't want to make it out that these stories are just like stories that you might read about straight people, but with gay people transplanted in. There are specific things that the characters deal with because they are gay. But it just felt like a different set of stories to the ones that we typically see in the media. There were 3 stories that really stood out to me. The first was Where the Heart Sleeps, about a man whose partner has died and he has to interact with his partner's unsupportive family about the estate. It was nice to read about like an older gay man who is having to deal with some prejudice but has some support from the family, and how he sort of copes with that after the passing of his partner. There's a story called Good Intentions about an academic being accused of sleeping with a student but being treated completely and unfairly differently compared to straight colleagues who have experienced the same thing. And then probably the one that hit me the hardest was the shortest story in the whole collection, which was called Michael's Possessions, about this man coming to collect his son's things after the straight marriage he was involved in has broken down. It's a really heartbreaking story that I won't spoil for you, but it has a lot of emotional impact. For me, all of these stories were really well conceived. They are heart-shattering situations, and they're doing what short stories do best as a medium, which is capturing this whole world inside a very short moment, telling an entire life story in just a tiny fragment of it. Overall, I really enjoyed getting a glimpse into these different Nigerian experiences, and something I loved that I have enjoyed in other Nigerian fiction is this interplay of different languages and how they're used to change modes of interactions or moods between characters, jumping between Hausa and Igbo and English to signal closeness or formality, and a bunch of other much more subtle things that I probably didn't pick up on. As with any collection, to be honest, not every single story was a hit. There are a few that I already don't really remember, but I did enjoy my time with it, and if Ifeakandu writes a novel at some point, I will definitely be interested in reading it. I was really hoping to be quite swift with those reviews, but I have a feeling this video might be quite long. Oops. If you did enjoy it though, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you are not subscribed, then now is a great time to hit the subscribe button. Let me know in the comments what you read in December and what you loved and what you didn't love so much. Let's have a chat about that. But until next time, toodles.